Hey everybody, hope you guys are doing great today. Let's go ahead and continue on with ethics with a quick interlude into logic. So I know what we really want to do is get started with ethics and be talking about what are the right things to do. But before we can really figure that out, before we could try to answer this question of are there actual factual moral claims out there that we can attach our opinions to, that we could, make our opinions like, we want to figure out how do we do that? How do we explore what a good answer is, what a bad answer is, or better yet, how do we just try to justify claims in general? So this is going to be a core part of philosophy in general, but also part of just any sort of field, science or discipline in general. And the idea is what we want to do is we want to hone in on what does it mean to make a good inference? Right? So an inference is the act of moving from evidence or reasons or a justification to a conclusion. So this happens all the time, right? You do this all the time. Somebody, right, flicks their blinker on and then you infer, oh, looks like they're about to turn or switch lanes, right? You go up to the restaurant and you pull on the door and it doesn't open and you infer that, oh, it looks like the restaurant is closed. Right? Or, right, in disciplines or in sciences, right, a scientist observes a population of species doing such and such thing, and then they infer, oh, it looks like this is going on, or it looks like they follow this behavior, or it looks like there's a change in the seasons, or the vegetation is changing, right? A physicist looks at the stars and watches how they move, and they infer, oh, it looks like this must be the correct model for how the universe works, right? All science is about inference, right, is about trying to go from some sort of evidence to some sort of conclusion, right? Science is all, and not just science, but so many parts of life are about inference, right? A lawyer or a police officer or a judge or a politician, right? They need to take evidence, ideally, and make good conclusions based on that evidence, right? That's how we would hope that those things go. So an argument is just our way of making these inferences precise. So in philosophy and in ethics, when we say argument, and in logic specifically, when we say argument, we don't mean two people shouting at each other, right, until they're blue in the face and somebody doesn't want to talk about it anymore, right? What we mean by argument is the idea that, or is just simply a list of statements, okay, where the first ones we're going to think of as premises. These are our justifying claims. And the second one we're going to be thinking about as, or excuse me, not the second one. The last one we're going to think about is the conclusion, right? So here's two examples of arguments, right? Here's some premises. A Greek person was mean to me once. Socrates was Greek. And then my conclusion, therefore Socrates was mean. And then here's another argument. All humans are mortal. Socrates was mortal. Therefore Socrates was human, therefore Socrates was mortal. So right here are two different arguments in which I'm making it very clear what my inference is. I'm telling you, I'm basing my opinion on these golds or right, orange spots, and I'm implying or I'm inferring, or I'm trying to convince you or support the belief that these conclusions are true. And the point is, as you can already see here, I hope, right, logic is going to be the study of trying to figure out which ones of these are bad and which ones are good. So hopefully you can already tell, yes, this one on the right, that's a good inference, right? Yep, all men are mortal, and Socrates, in fact, was immortal. And these two things are good justifications for believing Socrates himself was immortal, right? The only way he wasn't immortal was if not all humans were mortal, or if he wasn't a human. But both of these things were true. On the other hand, this argument, right, this is of course a bad argument, right? Just because a Greek person was mean to you one time and Socrates was Greek does not mean that he's mean, right? This is what we call jumping to conclusion, right? This is a bad inference. Your reasons here don't support your conclusion. So the point of logic is to try to figure out, okay, which ones are good and which ones are bad. Right? Here, I gave you kind of two easy or intuitive arguments, right? Like, I hope all of you can pretty quickly tell that, yep, that's a bad argument. Just because one Greek person was mean and Socrates was Greek, just that alone does not justify that Socrates himself was mean, even if he was mean, to be clear. Even if Socrates was mean, this is a bad argument. Those were not good reasons to accept that conclusion. Over here, this is a good argument, right? I really should accept that conclusion based on those premises. So, in any time we have an argument, the idea is we're going to be asking two questions. Okay, we're going to first ask, are those premises actually true? Right? So, was a Greek person actually mean to you one time? Maybe that was true. Was Socrates actually Greek? I do know that that was true. And then right over here, I might ask, are all humans actually mortal? Right? That's true. Was Socrates actually human? Yes, that was true. But then secondly, I could ask, suppose they were true, right? Set aside the question of if they were true. This is just going to be a separate, independent question. Is there any possibility that the conclusion isn't true too? Right? If the premises were true, is it guaranteed that the conclusion is true? What do I mean by that? Well, look at these two. Suppose that a Greek person really was mean to me one time, and Socrates was mean. Does that guarantee that that Socrates was Greek? Does that guarantee that Socrates was mean? Well, no. Like I might completely believe these two things, right? I can think the world going this way, where yep, a Greek person really was mean to me once, and Socrates was Greek, I'm sorry. But Socrates isn't mean, right? Like I can imagine that happening. In validity, that's what we want to do. We're setting aside whether or not the premises are actually true in this validity question. We're just trying to ask, if they were true, is there any possible way that the conclusion is false? And here, yeah, I can think of a hypothetical scenario where both of my premises were true, but my conclusion is false. So that means the premises didn't entail the conclusion, right? The premises could be true, and that says nothing about whether or not the conclusion is true. Compare that to this argument. If these premises are true, is there any possible way the conclusion isn't true? Well, no, right? If Socrates is not a mortal, right? If the conclusion were false, well then either he's not a human or we have a human that's not mortal. So the conclusion being false would just force one of the premises to be false. The only way it could be false is if one of these failed to be true. But if these were both true, it leaves us no room but to say, yeah, Socrates, in fact, was mortal. Why? Well, because all humans are mortal, and Socrates was one of those humans. So this is our first taste of the difference between a good and a bad inference. In one of them, right, in the bad inference, the premises don't actually lead to the conclusion. I can believe the premises all day long, but I never have to believe the conclusion. In the second one, as soon as I believe the premises, I should believe the conclusion. It comes along for free. It's automatic. It's entailed. It follows, right? I'm not jumping to that conclusion. I'm taking a nice, pleasant stroll to it. Okay, so that second question is what we mean by validity, right? This idea that an argument, for an argument, it's impossible for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true, right? That's what we mean by validity. Can that conclusion be false if the premises were true? And we can phrase this in a couple other ways, right? And I'll do this from time to time just to help you internalize this definition a little bit more. So these are both just equivalent ways of saying the same exact question. Is it possible for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true? Does the conclusion being false ensure that one of the premises is false? If the premises were true, is the conclusion guaranteed to be true? Right? I'm not asking three different questions there. I'm asking one question in three different ways. I'm just asking, is there any chance where the premises are true and the conclusion is false? And if the answer to that is no, then you are guaranteed to believe that these premises entail the conclusion. That's what it means to say the premises entail the conclusion. Okay. So what happens if you say yes to both of these? If your premises are true and if they were true, the conclusion is guaranteed? Well, shoot. If the premises were true, the conclusion is guaranteed, and the premises are true, well, that means the conclusion is guaranteed to be true, right? If we have a valid argument, that means as soon as we verify the premises are true, we know we can believe the conclusion. So as soon as we add to that true premises, boom, we get the conclusion. This is what we call a sound argument. Okay, a sound argument is a valid argument with true premises. So the idea is a valid argument is one where if your premises, right, if your premises were true, we'd give you the conclusion would follow. And then when you add to that yes, you really did have those true premises, then boom, we think, oh, well then the conclusion comes for free. And so that's why we call these sound arguments, right? We can think about these as essentially the gold standard of an argument, right? These are arguments where we're starting from good places and we're only making good inferences, right? We started with good data and we only did good statistics on that data, right? So imagine, for instance, somebody comes to you with a particular scientific claim or something like that, right? They want to convince you that the Platte water levels are rising over time or something like that, right? And they bring you this data, right, that they've acquired by doing tests, and they've also, right, the data is just random numbers, so they've done, right, thinking about that data. They've said, because of these numbers and all of these figures, I think it follows that the river level is rising, right? Maybe they had to average a whole bunch of numbers together. Maybe they had to do some variance calculations. Maybe they had to do this, that, and the other, right? Well, there's always and only two questions we can ask, right? And this is how peer review in science honestly works at the heart of it. You ask, is your data itself legitimate? Are you starting from a good place, right? Was it maybe your instruments were faulty? Maybe your lab tech was duplicitous in trying to undermine you, right? Whatever it is, maybe somebody lied about something or made a mistake, whatever it is. Are the premises and is the data itself good, right, that this person is coming with? And then, did you do good statistics on it, right? Based on that data, does that data actually support the conclusion that you're trying to say, right? Did you actually average it together correctly? Did you average the right things together correctly? Did you do the right error calculations, right? So we can ask, did you start from the right place? And then did you make the right steps? And if you did both of those things, then we know you have a sound argument. And sound arguments are ones where the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. Right? Because a valid argument is one where if the premises were true, the conclusion would be guaranteed. So as soon as you add to that you really do have those true premises, boom, we get that conclusion for free. So that's what we're going to be interested in the course, right? This is going to be one way in which we can try to communicate why we think certain things are true, why we should accept or reject certain views. Now, different philosophers are going to think about arguments in different ways, and by that I mean like the significance or importance of finding arguments, right? Some philosophers are going to try to find a specific argument that guarantees beyond a shadow of a doubt why you should believe this theory or do this thing. But short of that, regardless of if you think we'll ever find those ultimate perfect arguments, these will still be extremely useful in a pragmatic way, because by doing these arguments, we're laying out exactly what our reasoning is, right? We're saying why we believe something, and doing so opens the door to hey, show me where the issue is, right? We shouldn't hide our reasoning. If when you're trying to justify something and you don't want somebody to ask certain questions, right, that's a big problem. What we want to do is we want to really explicitly demonstrate our reasoning so that way the other person can accept it or point out to us, oh, no, here are your issues. And whenever somebody points out an issue in my argument, I think, oh, that's awesome, because now I can make a better argument, right? I can improve on where I was. So, right, if somebody doesn't want to accept that Socrates was mortal, I can ask him, or them, or her, is it that Socrates isn't human? Or is it that Socrates wasn't, or is it that all humans aren't mortal, right? Which of these premises do you want to reject? Or do you want to reject that even if you accept these premises, you wouldn't have to accept that conclusion, right? But the point is, when we lay this out as an argument, we get to ask those questions. We get to ask, are your starting points true? And do they actually entail the conclusion you want them to entail? Okay, so let's look at a few examples then, right? So, oh, yeah, here we go. So let's look at these examples of arguments right here. So I have 4 arguments, and let's take a second and try to think about what do we think the differences are in each of these arguments. Now, I mean, some of these differences are somewhat obvious, right? I said Socrates is a human, then he's mortal. If Socrates is an alien, then he can read minds, right? So, like, clearly some of these are going to be talking about different things. But let's try to figure out the differences with regards to whether or not we think these are good arguments. And spoiler alert, there's going to be 2, well, this really shouldn't be a spoiler because I just gave you these 2 questions. There's going to be 2 different ways in which we can evaluate these arguments. Right? So let's think about this first one first. If Socrates is mortal, or is human, then he is mortal. Socrates is human, therefore he's mortal. Right? This is essentially just the argument I had up here, except now I'm not just talking about all humans here. I plugged in Socrates. But the idea is, it's also seemingly a good argument, right? These seem like true premises. If you're a human, then you're mortal. Socrates is human. So, right, it seems like we have true premises. And then we could also ask, okay, now do we think it's a valid argument? But for at least a moment, let's set that aside. What I want to do is I want to think about just this true premises question. So, this top left argument here has true premises. What about the top right argument? If Socrates is an alien, then he can read minds. Socrates is an alien. Well, I don't know about premise 1. I'm skeptical about premise 1. But I definitely reject premise 2. I don't, like, premise 2 is false, right? Like, that's not a big mystery. Socrates is not an alien. So, the first difference we can find between these arguments is that this one on the left, top left, has true premises, and the one on the right has false premises. And just cutting to the chase, right, we can see that for both of these, both the ones on the left and both the ones on the right, right? So, like, the bottom left, if Socrates is human, then he's mortal, right? Still true. Socrates is mortal. That's also a true statement, right? Argument on the bottom right, if Socrates is an alien, then he can read minds. Again, I'm still unsure about that, but we're just going to set that aside, because the second one I'm definitely sure about. He can't read minds. He doesn't have telepathy, right? So this is a false premise. Right? So this is just one way in which we can decide whether or not that these arguments are good arguments or not, right? The ones on the left here have true premises. They've started from legitimate starting points, whereas the ones on the right have not, right? They have assumed false premises. Their reasoning has already started in the wrong place, right? I shouldn't believe that Socrates is an alien. I shouldn't believe that he can read minds. But I should believe he's a human, and I should believe he's immortal. So these premises are, right? These are true premises. These are false premises. Okay. So that's one way in which we can differentiate these arguments. But let's think about another. So, okay, sure. Socrates isn't an alien. I get it. But let's think about this argument a little bit more carefully. Because there's some things that I really do like about this argument, right? If Socrates were an alien, so premise 1 says if Socrates were an alien, then he can read minds. So if I were to accept this, and if I were to accept that he's an alien, well, then I really should accept that he can read minds. I shouldn't avoid that, right? And so here I'm thinking about this validity question. Right? Is it possible for that conclusion to be false if the premises are true? And here, right, the answer is no. If I were to accept that Socrates is an alien, right? Imagine that hypothetically. Imagine that it was the case that Socrates is an alien. And imagine that being an alien really did mean that you could read minds. Well, then we would have to accept that Socrates can read minds. Right? The only way that Socrates can't read minds is if either he's not an alien, or if being an alien doesn't really lead you to being into reading minds, right? Either premise 2 has to be false or premise 1 has to be false if the conclusion were to be false. But the point is, if the premises were true, they would force that conclusion to be true. This is what we mean by a valid argument, right? This is the same thing going on over here. Set aside whether or not you even knew who Socrates was, or if you, like, maybe you thought, like, he was my pet turtle or something. Still, you would say this is valid. If you were human, you would be mortal. Sure, suppose I accept that. And if you're, and let's just suppose, hypothetically, that Socrates is a human, right? Even if he wasn't in the real world, or even if you weren't sure about that in the real world, right? If you hypothetically accept these two premises, we would have to accept that conclusion. The only way he's not mortal is if either he's not a human, or if being a human doesn't really lead you to being mortal. Okay, so let's see how does this cash out down below. So here, right, I'm saying if Socrates is a human, then he's mortal. Socrates is mortal, therefore he's a human. So we can ask, now we're going to set aside whether or not these are true premises. Is this a valid argument? If I accept that being a human leads to being mortal, and Socrates is immortal, does that mean Socrates is human? Well, certainly not. Based on these premises alone, Socrates might just be my pet turtle after all. We're asking whether or not the premises themselves guarantee that conclusion, or do they leave any wiggle room for us to say, no, it could be false. Not that it has to be false, but could it be false? Is there any possible way the conclusion's false if the premises are true? And here, yes, I can fully believe premise 1, that being a human leads you to being mortal. And I can believe premise 2, that my little pet turtle is in fact mortal. But that doesn't mean I think Socrates, my little pet turtle, is in fact a human. For the record, I don't actually have a pet turtle, but for the sake of this example, let's pretend I do. Right? So notice the difference in the form here. We'll spend a little bit more time on this in just a moment. But here, I was saying, if you're an A, then you're a B. And you are an A, therefore you're a B. Here I'm saying, if A, then B. And B, therefore A. Again, we'll spend more time on this in just a second. But let's look at this bottom right argument to see the same thing. Right? And at this point, we can go ahead and move down here. Right? To see both of these top arguments are valid and both of these bottom ones are invalid. Look, this one is going to have the same form as this other one, right? So look, this is saying if orange, then purple. Purple is true, therefore orange. And this one is saying if orange, then purple. Purple is true, therefore orange. But let's look at this in just a second. If you're an alien, then you can read minds. And then we're saying you can read minds. But does that mean this person is an alien? Well, no, right? Because it's saying being an alien leads to reading minds. And this person can read minds. But based on these premises alone, that doesn't tell me that only aliens can read minds. Maybe all aliens can read minds, but that doesn't mean only aliens can do it. Maybe Socrates is, again, something else that can read minds, right? Something very different from an alien. So that would mean Socrates, this conclusion doesn't necessarily follow. I can imagine a world where my premises are both true without my conclusion being true. I can't do that with the top two arguments. As soon as I imagine a world where my premises are true in these ones, I have to accept that the conclusion is also true there. And notice what's similar about them, right? And this is what I was just giving you a little glimpse of. Notice the form of the top is to say, if A is true, or if A leads to B, and A is actually true, then we should really get B, right? Premise 1 is saying, if A, then B, right? A necessary consequence of A is B. A is sufficient for getting B. And so that means if on premise 2 we can specify, and we really do have A, that means we really do get B, right? Down here we're saying if A, then B, same conditional, same if then, but now we're saying, and we really do have the B. But that doesn't mean we had A, that doesn't mean we went through A to get there, right? If I said, if you're rich, then you're, if you're an actor, then you're rich. Bill Gates is an actor. That means Bill Gates is rich, right? This might be a false premise, but it follows. Yeah, let me think of a more intuitive example, because that is a false premise. If you're an actor, then you're rich. Brad Pitt is an actor, therefore Brad Pitt is rich, right? Like that intuitively follows. If you're an actor, then you're rich. Bill Gates is rich. That doesn't mean Bill Gates is an actor, though, right? Both of those premises might be true, right? Or at least like for extremely successful actors, right? But that doesn't mean the conclusion follows, right? If you're an extremely successful actor, then you're rich. Brad Pitt is an extremely successful actor, therefore Brad Pitt is rich. If you're an extremely successful actor, then you're rich. Bill Gates is rich, therefore Bill Gates is an extremely successful actor, right? This form just doesn't work. No matter what we put into this form, it's not going to work. This is what we call a fallacy. This is what we call affirming the consequent. Right? So we call this affirming the consequent, because the idea is, it's like we give this conditional, if this, then that. If antecedent is what we technically call this, then consequent is what we call this. And then the idea is we're affirming the consequent. Not the if part, but the then part. We're saying, if you do this, then this will happen. And you're saying, hey, that happened. But that doesn't mean this was the cause. Right? If you're playing basketball, then you must own a basketball. I own a basketball. Well, that doesn't mean I'm playing basketball, right? I might just be sitting on the floor, right? If you win the lottery, then you have $1 million. Bill Gates has $1 million. That doesn't mean Bill Gates won the lottery, right? Comparing that to, if you won the lottery, then you have $1 million, and this person actually won the lottery, therefore that person actually has $1 million. Or, if I'm playing basketball, then I own a basketball. I'm playing basketball, therefore I own a basketball. Or if I own a basketball, then I am at least using a bat. If I'm playing basketball, then I'm at least using a basketball. I'm playing basketball, therefore I'm at least using a basketball. Okay, the point is, these structures are what matter here. Notice that for both of these arguments, they're using the same valid structure, the same if left then right, and left is actually true, therefore right is actually true. Right? If left then right, left is actually true, therefore right is actually true. Compare that to if left then right, and right is actually true, therefore left is true, right? This is that valid structure. So the point of all of this is just to help you see that it's the structure that matters here for validity. If you're interested in this sort of thing, this is what we dive into much more in a logic class. So definitely check out logic courses for this specifically. It gets really interesting in a lot of different ways. But the idea is we want to be able to separate different ways in which we can interrogate somebody's reasoning, right? So the point is, we can ask, is your argument valid versus invalid? That's the question we were just talking about, right? Is it the case that accepting your reasons really leads to your conclusion? And both of these top arguments check that box. And then we can ask, well, okay, and then are the premises actually true or are they false, right? Right. So we could ask, if they were true, do they lead to the conclusion? Then we can say, and are they actually true, right? And the point is, if we do both of those things, if we know that if our premises are true, then the conclusion is true, and we're also able to verify that the premises are actually true, then we have a sound argument. And the reason why we like sound arguments is because those are the arguments where we're guaranteed to believe this conclusion. So the point of these 4 arguments are to show you the 4 different ways in which you can satisfy or fail at each of these criteria. So this top left argument is the one sound argument we looked at, right? This is the one argument that's both valid and it has true premises. This argument, right, has true premises, but it's invalid. I can accept these premises, and I do, all day long, but I don't have to accept that conclusion, right? Even though it's actually true, it's not a guarantee based on these premises. I don't have to accept this conclusion based on these premises alone, right? The top right one suffers from exactly the opposite problems. It's got false premises. It's assuming false things I do not believe that Socrates is an alien, nor do I really believe that if he were an alien, he could read minds. But I would, if I accepted these premises, I would accept that conclusion. So this is valid. And then finally, the bottom right suffers from both problems, right? It's assuming false things, and even if I accepted those false things, it doesn't really get me that conclusion, right? So this argument fails to be sound on both counts. So all three of these arguments here are unsound, but they're all unsound for different reasons, right? This one's unsound because it's valid with false premises. This one's unsound because it has true premises, but it's invalid. And this one fails at both counts. It's only when we have true premises and those premises guarantee the conclusion that we would call this argument sound. And this is what we're after. Now, what I want to do is I want to finish up by talking about just like the intuition behind this, because so often I'm asked, wait a second, when you're thinking through things or trying to explain yourself or whatever, do you always just slow down and write things out as an argument? Like if I'm debating someone in real life, right? Like in family or friends or strangers or whoever. And the point is, like, right, depending on the situation, sure, you might get more careful about this stuff. But like this is no different than when you do mental math or mental physics, right? Like if somebody says, if you knew you had like 5 apples and somebody stole 3 of them, right? Like you didn't have to sit there and write it down. You just intuitively grasp what's going on, right? And you operate. Or if somebody threw a ball at your face, you don't need to sit down and do the calculus to figure out how soon is it going to hit you and where should we, right? You do the mental math. And the idea is we want to, we want to build the intuitions to be doing the same sort of things with logic itself. So in a logic class, we spend a lot more time building that intuition. So just like a physicist might get a lot better at that sort of intuition, right? We want to get better at this logical intuition. But whenever we engage with something, we want to first ask, okay, so separate the reasons from the conclusion, right? This should not be like a weird technical thing you're doing. This should just be a very intuitive, automatic thing you do. What are your reasons and what's the conclusion? And then it's just 2 very simple questions. I know, maybe I shouldn't say simple because this validity stuff really can be a little bit confusing when you first learn about it. But like, as you start to acquire what this really is, it's just this straightforward question. Do your premises lead to the conclusion? Should I accept that conclusion based on your premises? Right? And that's all we need to ask. Right? So when I am discussing something with someone, I very much do ask, like, oh, okay, first of all, what are you basing this view on? Just like, help me understand, what are your assumptions or your premises or your justifications? And then, right, I'll think, okay, I have 2 questions to ask now. I could either ask, well, I don't like those premises. I think that assumption is dubious, or I think that data is flawed. Or I could say, well, okay, cool, I agree with all of those starting points, but I don't actually think that means what you think it means. I don't actually think that means we should enact this policy, or we should follow this rule, or we should believe this thing, right? So again, this might, as we're learning this sort of thing, right, it might feel like, okay, we're dealing with a lot of structure and new terminology and definitions and that sort of thing. But the point is to make this sort of thing intuitive, right? To try to internalize this way of approaching things. Anytime you want to explore your own or someone else's justification, you should separate their reasons for what they're saying from the conclusion itself. And you should ask, are those in themselves good starting points, and do those starting points really lead to the thing they want me to find? Okay, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and take care.